In 2 Kings chapter 4, the prophet Elisha walked into a kitchen where a pot of stew was about to kill a roomful of men. A famine had driven one of the young prophets into the field to gather herbs, and he had come back with a lapful of wild gourds he did not recognize. They sliced the gourds into the pot. They added water and grain. They served it. The men took one taste and cried out, "There is death in the pot." And they could not eat it. Elisha said only 3 words, "Bring some meal." He cast a handful of barley flour into the boiling stew, and the harm was gone. The men ate. The men lived. The chronicler thought it worth recording 2,500 years later. The Hebrew text uses one word for what was in that pot. Nezid, pottage, soup. The first medicine of the Bible was not a tablet or an ointment or a poultice. It was a pot on a fire, and the cure was something the cook had on the shelf. They cooked differently. Most people today think of soup as comfort food, the thing you reach for when you have a cold, the thing your grandmother brought when you were tired. The Bible treats the pot on the fire as the structural center of household healing, the place where grain and bone and herb and oil were combined into something the body could actually absorb. The Hebrew word marak, the word for soup, appears beside the word nezid throughout the Old Testament, and both words describe what the working poor ate every night, and what the prophets ate when they were sick, and what the kings were brought when their wounds would not close. The pottage was not a meal beside the medicine. The pottage was the medicine. Archaeologists digging the houses of Bronze Age Canaan have found round-based clay cooking pots in the central room of nearly every dwelling, ringed with the ash of nightly fires. Every household had one. Every household used it. We replaced it with something engineered to last on a shelf, and we forgot what the pot was for. These 20 soups fed and healed the prophets, the patriarchs, the soldiers, and the working poor of every household from Genesis to Revelation. They were not luxury. They were not occasional. They were the nightly architecture of how a body was kept whole. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 biblical soups that rebuild your body from the inside. Number 20. The wild herb pottage of Elisha. 2 Kings chapter 4. The story of the same pot we opened earlier. A young prophet gathered wild gourds and brought home what scholars now believe was colocynth, a vine whose fruit contains powerful purgative alkaloids that can shut down the gut in hours. Elisha threw barley flour into the boiling pot. The starches in the flour bind the alkaloids and pull them out of suspension. The harm went out of the food. A grandmother in Galilee 1,000 years later still kept a small bowl of barley flour beside the stove for the same reason. The miracle was real. The mechanism was older than the prophet who used it. Number 19. Egyptian leek and onion broth. Numbers 11. The soup the Israelites wept for in the wilderness. The soup they had eaten in Egypt as slaves, that they could not stop remembering. A pot of leeks and onions simmered in water and salt is one of the oldest medicines on earth. The compound kaempferol, abundant in the green tops most cooks throw away, lowered blood pressure within hours by a measurable margin in modern human studies. The slaves who built the pyramids ate this broth at supper. The slaves outlived the pharaohs. Number 18. The lentil pottage of Esau. Genesis 25. The red stew Jacob cooked at the door of his tent the day his brother came in from the field, starving. Esau traded his birthright for a single bowl. People have argued for 3,000 years about how a man could be foolish enough to do that. Anyone who has been truly hungry and been handed a bowl of slow-simmered red lentils knows the answer. Lentils carry 13 grams of plant protein per serving. The iron a hunter loses through exertion, and the slow-burning carbohydrates the body craves at the edge of collapse. Carbonized lentil seeds have been found in the Near East, dating to 7,000 years before Christ. A bowl restored Esau in the time it took him to eat. The pottage that bought a kingdom. Number 17. The bone broth of the shepherds. Leviticus 7, the peace offerings, describes how the bones of every sacrificed animal were given to the priests and to the worshippers and brought home to the pot. Nothing was thrown away. The bones were simmered for hours in clay vessels until the broth turned to gel. Modern researchers credit the glycine and the glutamine in slowly simmered bone broth with sealing the lining of the gyut, and with calming the inflammation that drives so many chronic diseases. The Egyptian Jewish physician Maimonides prescribed chicken broth for upper respiratory illness in the 12th century, and a University of Nebraska study in the year 2000 confirmed that the broth measurably reduced inflammatory cell migration. Maimonides did not invent it. He inherited it from the women of Israel who had been simmering bones for 3,000 years. Number 16. The barley soup of the first fruits. 2 Kings 4, again, just 3 verses after Elisha purified the pot. A man came from Baal-Shalisha bringing 20 loaves of barley bread and fresh ears of grain. Barley was the first crop to ripen each spring, the grain of Passover, the grain Ruth gleaned in the field of Boaz. Barley carries the highest content of beta-glucan of any cereal, the soluble fiber the FDA recognized in 2012 for its proven ability to lower cholesterol when consumed at 3 grams per day. A bowl of barley soup at supper does what a prescription statin tries to do, more slowly and without harm to the liver. The soup the prophets ate. Still on the shelf for $2 a bag. Number 15. The fish stew of Galilee. In Luke chapter 24, the broiled fish Jesus ate after the resurrection. In John chapter 21, the fish breakfast he made for the disciples on the shore. The fishermen of Galilee made stews from tilapia and sardines, simmered with onions and herbs in the clay pots of the lakeside villages. Even the leaner fish of freshwater carry the omega-3 fatty acids the brain uses to regulate mood, and the connective tissue uses to fight inflammation. Selenium supported the thyroid, and vitamin D from the skin and bones simmered into the broth. This was the brain food of the apostles. They were men who walked across an empire on what the Sea of Galilee gave them. Number 14. Garlic and onion soup of the builders. The pyramid workers received a daily ration of garlic, leeks, and onions recorded on the walls of the tombs and on the papyri of the Egyptian overseers. Numbers 11 names them as the food the Israelites missed by name. A soup of crushed garlic, simmered briefly in broth, releases allicin, the sulfur compound the body uses as a natural antimicrobial. Galen, the Greek physician, called it the rustic theriac, the cure for everything. The onion gives quercetin, the compound the body uses to keep the histamine response from overshooting in spring. A bowl at the first scratch in the throat often headed off a cold by morning. A grandmother in Damascus made it the moment a child sneezed twice, and the family stayed well through the winter. Number 13. Bitter herb soup of Passover. Exodus 12, the soup of remembrance, the bitter herbs the Lord commanded Israel to eat with the lamb and the unleavened bread. Endive, dandelion, and chicory root are the bitter greens of the Levantine spring. The compounds in bitter greens stimulate bile flow from the liver and restart digestion that has gone slow through the long winter months. A small bowl before the main meal opened the gut for everything that followed. The Passover Seder still includes the maror 3,000 years later because the body still needs it. The remembrance and the medicine were always the same act. Number 12. Cucumber and mint cooling broth of Egypt. Numbers 11. The cucumbers the Israelites missed by name. Matthew 23, where Jesus mentioned mint among the herbs the Pharisees tithed. A cool soup of cucumber, mint, yogurt, or goat milk, and a pinch of salt was eaten at the hot end of every Egyptian summer. Cucumber is 95% water, bound with silica and trace minerals that connective tissue absorbs slowly. The menthol in mint relaxes the smooth muscle of the intestinal wall faster than most modern antispasmodics. A grandmother in the Nile Delta served it at noon, and the whole household slept through the heat without waking thirsty. Number 11. Fig and date sweet pottage. 2 Kings chapter 20 tells how the dying King Hezekiah was healed by a poultice of mashed figs laid on the boil that was killing him. The same figs, simmered with grain and dates into a sweet pottage, carried the protein-cleaving enzyme phycin into the gut. Phycin breaks down inflammation from the inside, the way the poultice broke it down from the outside. Dates added the potassium that restored a body collapsed from heat or fever in the time it took to swallow. A figure on his deathbed was restored. A book of the Bible records the cure in 2 verses, without explanation, because explanation was not needed. The figs worked. The figs still work. Pause for a moment on a single line in the book of Proverbs, chapter 17, verse 22. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. The verse names the body and the spirit in the same breath, and the soup pot was the place where the two met. The grandmother stirring the pottage at supper. The family gathered close around the warmth. The slow simmer that filled the house with the smell of bone and herb was activating what modern science has only just named the vagus nerve, the long fiber that carries the body out of stress and into the parasympathetic state where digestion and repair finally happen. The soup did not just feed the body. The soup signaled to the body that it was safe enough to heal. The grandmother knew this without naming it. The pottage was the merry heart on the table. Number 10. Chickpea and cumin stew. Isaiah 28 names the cumin the prophet watched being threshed in the fields. The chickpea soup of the Galilean working class was simmered with cumin, garlic, and a splash of olive oil. Chickpeas carry folate and magnesium, the minerals the nervous system burns through every working day. Cumin's compound thymoquinone is studied now for what it does to inflammation in the gut and to insulin sensitivity. The soup of the laboring man, the food a body could work 8 hours on without crashing. Number 9. Almond milk pottage. Genesis 43. The almonds Jacob sent in tribute to Egypt. Number 17. The rod of Aaron that miraculously sprouted almond blossoms. Soaked almonds, ground in water, and simmered with barley, made a creamy white pottage that carried magnesium, vitamin E, and the monounsaturated fats the brain uses to repair its membranes overnight. The merchants of Egypt paid in silver for almonds. The grandmother who served the pottage knew her family slept through the night without waking. Number 8. The pulse stew of Daniel. Daniel, chapter 1. 4 young men taken captive into Babylon refused the king's rich food and asked for 10 days of pulse and water instead. The Hebrew word zeroah means seeds and legumes. It refers to a simple soup of beans, lentils, and barley simmered slowly in plain water. At the end of 10 days, they appeared healthier and better nourished than every other captive who had eaten the king's meat. Modern medical historians have called this the first recorded controlled dietary trial in human history. 3,000 years before clinical research had a name, 4 prisoners proved that the pottage of the poor outperformed the meal of the king. The book records the result without commentary because the book did not need to argue. Number 7. Coriander and manna pottage. Exodus chapter 16 describes the manna of the wilderness as being the color of bdellium and tasting like coriander seed. Numbers chapter 11 says the people gathered it, ground it in mills, beat it in mortars, baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. But the same chapter says they boiled it in pots. A pottage of coriander seed simmered with grain has been a folk remedy for blood sugar regulation across the Middle East for thousands of years. The compound linalool in coriander is studied now for the same effect: a gentle lowering of glucose after the meal, a calming of the gut, a slow burn the body could walk on through the long desert mornings. Number 6. Pomegranate and lamb stew. Song of Solomon 4 mentions the pomegranate among the spiced fruits of the wedding garden. A stew of lamb simmered with pomegranate juice, onions, and a handful of grain was the soup of the marriage feast across the ancient Levant. Punica ligands are some of the most potent antioxidants ever measured in a fruit. The iron from the lamb, the polyphenols from the pomegranate, and the slow simmer made both available to the gut. It was the blood builder of the wedding chamber. A grandmother served it to a young bride and a young groom because she knew what the body needed for the work ahead. Number 5. Olive oil and bread sop. In the book of Ruth, chapter 2, Boaz said to Ruth, "Come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar." The Hebrew word chametz was sour wine, but the same vessel held warm olive oil and salt at most workers' meals, and the bread was torn into the bowl until the oil and the bread became a kind of soup. Cold-pressed olive oil carries oleocanthal, the compound that mimics ibuprofen at the molecular level, blocking the same inflammatory enzymes the modern pill blocks, more gently and without harm to the kidney. It was the widow's daily medicine, the simplest pottage in Scripture, and the most studied compound in modern Mediterranean research. Number 4. Sour wine and vegetable broth of the soldier. In the same chapter of Ruth, the chametz that workers dipped their bread into was the basis of the Roman soldiers' drink called posca, a thin broth of vinegar, water, herbs, and sometimes a little oil. The acetic acid in the vinegar slowed the absorption of sugar and supported the lining of the gut. The polyphenols in the herbs did the slow work of every modern adaptogen. The Roman legionnaire drank it on the march. The Galilean field worker drank it at noon. The sponge offered to Christ on the cross was soaked in it. Number 3. Honey and goat milk posset. 1 Samuel chapter 14. The chapter we know best for what Jonathan did in the woods of Michmash. The honey from the comb that restored him in a swallow. The same chapter sits in a tradition where warm goat milk, raw honey, and a pinch of salt were given to anyone who had collapsed from exertion or fever. The glucose entered the blood within minutes. The electrolytes from the salt rebuilt what the sweat had taken. The antimicrobial peptides in raw honey, identified only in the last 50 years of modern research, did the slow work of clearing whatever infection had brought the body down. The original recovery drink, 3,000 years before sports science gave it a name. Number 2. The widow's oil stew. In 1 Kings chapter 17, the widow of Zarephath told Elijah she had nothing left in the house but a handful of meal in a barrel and a little oil in a cruse. Elijah told her to make a small cake first for him, and the meal would not waste and the oil would not fail. What she made was the simple pottage in Scripture: flour, olive oil, water, and a pinch of salt, simmered briefly in a clay pot. She and her son and the prophet ate it for many days. It is the same dish the widow in 2 Kings 4 was told by Elisha to make when her oil multiplied. 2 prophets, 2 widows, 2 pots, the same meal. Olive oil, flour, water. The 4 ingredients of the survival of the prophets. The pottage of the working poor that fed Israel through every famine the Bible records. Number 1. The marrow broth of the Messianic feast. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6, names the soup of the world to come, In this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the lees well refined. The Hebrew is specific. Mamchayim, marrow. Bone marrow simmered slowly until the broth turns to gel, the most ancient soup in Scripture and the most modern medicine in the laboratory. Glycine, glutamine, collagen, gelatin, the four compounds modern researchers credit with sealing the gut lining, calming inflammation, rebuilding connective tissue, and restoring the cells that line the intestine. The promised soup of the Messianic age is the soup the grandmothers of the Bible were already making every Friday afternoon for the Sabbath table. The promise was not new. The promise was a kitchen the prophets already knew. Return for a moment to the pot in 2 Kings 4. The death in the pot, the meal cast in, the harm undone. Every modern chronic disease is a kind of slow poison in the pot, the inflammation, the sugar, the processed displacement of what real food used to be. Most people are eating from a pot that is killing them on a schedule slow enough that they have stopped noticing. The pharmacy aisle is loud, the marketing is loud, the promise of a faster cure in a smaller pill is loud. The pot on the stove is quiet. The biblical soups were the meal cast in, the slow simmer, the bone, the lentil, the leek, the olive oil, the bitter herb, the marrow, the barley, the cumin, the fig. The pot still works. The pot has always worked. The grandmother, who set a clay vessel over the fire at the end of the day, who threw in what the field had given her, who waited the slow hours while the bone gave up its marrow and the herb gave up its oil, was practicing a medicine that took 4,000 years to perfect and less than 100 to forget. The body has not changed. The body still absorbs what it absorbed in the kitchens of Galilee. The pot does not need to change. A handful of barley, a few bones from the butcher, an onion, a head of garlic, a sprig of whatever green is in season, a glug of olive oil, salt, water, time. That is the recipe. That is every recipe. Set a pot of bones simmering on a Sunday afternoon. Let the smell fill the house through the slow hours. Eat it warm at supper. Notice how you sleep that night. Observe how your gut feels in the morning. The vault of Scripture is not a museum. It is a kitchen. And the meal cast in is still on the shelf. The next vault opens soon.